Assalamu alaikum. Thank you for staying with us. Welcome back to the Mid-Morning Talk with your host, Aaliyah, proudly sponsored by Sanzaf. Sanzaf is looking to bring its successful chef school program to Johannesburg, and they need your support to make it possible. The Sanzaf Chef School equips young people with accredited culinary training, workplace readiness, and real pathways into the hospitality industry. Through this program, students gain more than cooking skills, they gain confidence, dignity, and the opportunity to build a better future. Your donation can help us open doors for the next generation of chefs in Johannesburg. Donate now at www.sanzaf.org.za and be part of changing lives through skills, opportunity, and empowerment. We have with us our next speaker for today. Our next speaker is Sosan Aboeid. Assalamu alaikum, Sosan. Welcome to the show.
Hey, assalamu alaikum, Aaliyah. It's an honor to be here.
It's so lovely to see you. Thank you so much for joining us.
Of course.
Sosan is a Sudanese American human rights researcher and advocate. She earned her BA in Middle Eastern Studies from Yale University in 2019. Sosan lived in Nablus, Palestine, where she taught world history and English language arts. She then consulted for the Human Rights, Conflict Resolution and Tolerance Program in Amman, Jordan, with the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees in the Near East. Before entering law school, Susan worked as a senior associate for the Arms Division at Human Rights Watch. She is also the co-curator of an exhibition titled A Prison, a Prisoner, and a Prison Guard, which explores the themes of carcerality in the MENA region through contemporary Middle Eastern prison art. She is currently at Georgetown Law and also a Bloom Public Interest Scholar and a Fritz Family Fellow with the Center on Privacy and Technology. MashaAllah. I'm very excited to get speaking and speak about all these different things that you have been involved in throughout the years. But before we start, what are you reading at the moment? And is there any writing or writer that currently intrigues you?
Yes, that's a great question. So I'm currently reading both fiction and nonfiction. I try to have some sort of balance. But for nonfiction, I'm reading a collected works, I have them next to me, of Martin Sostre. This is called I Cannot Stand for Injustices. And essentially, Martin Sostre was a Black Puerto Rican sort of jailhouse lawyer, revolutionary, around the time of like the civil rights movement. He has a lot of writings and letters that he penned from prison. So I was reading that, and the reason I stumbled upon this is I went to a talk recently at the public library, and the author or the editor of this collection was there talking about just Martin and his experiences and sort of like the archival work. So I've been getting really into sort of like archiving and who becomes well known versus who doesn't, and it's all depending on like who we have access to in terms of like have access to it in the archive. For fiction, I'm reading My Brilliant Friend by Elena Ferrante. I'm not sure if you're familiar, but it's part of the Napolitanian, I'm going to butcher this pronunciation, but it's a series of 4 books. But I was reading that, and mostly just based off of recommendations for friends, and I really wanted to get into fiction again. So I'm enjoying that sort of like slow read. I want to say a beach read, but it's more of like, just trying to get through. But it's good. I would recommend it.
It's important to have a balance, especially when on a daily basis, a lot of your reading is probably really heavy.
Exactly.
Yeah. So thank you so much for sharing. I know that a lot of the work that you're doing now, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, is on surveillance and how surveillance is operating in the world. And I know that you spent time in Palestine. I think that was 2017, 18, around those years?
2019.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, I mean, obviously, I feel like surveillance has changed a lot since then and has also remained the same. So could you maybe comment on what did you notice then and what are you noticing now in the Palestinian context, but also in the global context in relation to surveillance?
Yeah. The thing about surveillance is, I like the way that you framed it, is that surveillance is very old, but it's also can be very new. I think that a lot of times when we think of surveillance, we mostly think of, all of these like high tech tools, right? We think of biometric surveillance, we think of facial recognition technology, we think of digital IDs. But I think that it's also important to think about surveillance in terms of like very rudimentary surveillance, right? It could be this sort of, even thinking about it as like peer to peer or like human to human
Mm-hmm.
surveillance. I think that one thing that my work on surveillance definitely stemmed from my experiences in Palestine, and during that time, I think a lot of things that was sort of that we witnessed, going through the different cities, going through Jerusalem, going through Al Khalid, seeing all the cameras, right, at like every corner, seeing cameras.
And it's so visible as well.
Exactly, very visible. And I think that
Yeah.
there's something to be said about the visibility of the cameras
Mhm.
too. Like I think that you're hitting on something that there's those cameras could work, right? They also could not work. Like we have no idea. But I think that
Mm.
there's something to be said about within the Palestinian context specifically about internalizing surveillance and internalizing the perspective or the view, whether that be true or not, that you are being surveilled, and how that impacts like the way that you go about your life, how that impacts your own like relation, that how it impacts communities, how it impacts families, and how it impacts like friends, etc. I think one thing that's like interesting, and Hamla, which is a digital organization based out of the West Bank, does a lot of great
Mhm.
writing about this. But they talk about, how a lot of these cameras, either in East Jerusalem or in Hebron, end up like you can see them being pointed within or like to inside people's homes. And there's like a quote that one Palestinian woman from one of the reports says, like this camera is pointing inside the house, like I have to sleep with my hijab on. Like it's like that level of
Mhm.
like invasiveness in terms of where the occupation has its eyes. But there's also an aspect of, that we're walking through, every time we walk through a checkpoint, we have to we're getting biometrically scanned, right? Either that's face print or fingerprint. And how does that affect like a psyche of a population that's already living under occupation? I
Absolutely. Yeah.
Yeah, I think that that's something that's to be kept in mind. I think throughout the years of me doing this work, one thing that I've noticed is just like the evolution in terms of technology. Like we think that it's like I was like, oh, every time you think that you have a grasp on like what tech is being used, you then
It's
are like
so harrowing.
bombarded on like X or Twitter with like,
Yeah.
oh, there's like some rumblings of this new type of technology. We're trying to figure out like what it is. You have people saying like, you know, we're seeing these like quadcopters like coming really close to our
Mhm.
faces, things like this. That's like honestly, it feels like the reality is a lot stranger than fiction. And one thing
Absolutely.
that about like Palestinian context I'd recommend is Anthony Lewiston has a book that came out a couple years ago called The Palestinian Laboratory or
Mhm.
The Palestine Laboratory. That one's really good. And
Very important
sort of,
book. Yeah.
yeah, talks about a lot of these technologies and like, being used and experimented on within this context.
Thank you for sharing. I mean, I also I like how you identified sort of like the old surveillance and the new surveillance and the layers. And I think in the Palestinian context we see it. I mean,
Yeah.
it's literally there in every form,
Yeah.
which is really scary. Um,
Exactly. And one thing to say, like, it's not like the old layers go away, right? It's like a lot of times people
yes,
are like, oh, like that's disappeared once you replace it with something more high tech. But no, I think that that's what kind of makes the fabric more intertwined and interwoven.
100%. And something I noticed, like in Palestine as well, is how I felt like there was a lot of advanced technology in surveillance as
Mhm.
opposed to in like Indian occupied Kashmir, where a lot of it
Yeah.
still relies on like human
Yeah.
intelligence, right?
Yeah.
People
Exactly.
on the ground, like spies, like that
Mhm.
kind of thing. And so, yeah, I think it's just really important to, when we're speaking about occupied peoples around the world,
Yep.
for people to really understand the layers and the depth of what they are going through on a daily basis, because it's not just that you're encountering an Israeli soldier, which is bad enough,
Yeah.
or an
Exactly.
Indian soldier, which is bad enough, but it's just like how you said, the surveillance literally compromising a Muslim woman's
Mhm.
privacy in her home, and we know how sacred that
Yeah.
is. And what's also really horrifying and concerning is that that surveillance is not only going to be unique to those contexts. You know, these technologies are exported around the world because it's a whole industry.
Yeah.
And so as citizens in South Africa, we have to be really aware of the sorts of things that, you know, might impact our daily lives. And, you know, we think about what's happening, for example, in South Africa with the Department of Home Affairs and regularizing people's statuses, you know.
Yep.
On the one hand, people want technology because they want things to be faster, but on the other hand, what does that also mean?
Yeah,
So
exactly.
it's really important to understand that these situations are not just unique to these places, they are impacting us everywhere.
Yeah, that's so great. And I like the way that I like that you brought up Kashmir in South Africa. I think that there's two things. A is that a lot of times, like, the resistance to these types of surveillance tech comes from sort of peer-to-peer, like cross, like transnational type of like collaboration, I want to say, like exchange, right? It's a lot of times the way that people are resisting these emerging tech in Palestine and in Gaza, for example, is similar to how people learn to resist or are resisting this technology in Kashmir. And I think that that's something to be said about, having these like networks of oppressed people, but it's also in a way of like networks of collaboration, but also empowerment across the world. And I do think that you brought up like a great thing about South Africa. And I think that there's an example there, and also within the States too, the way that we're thinking about technology too, is that, a lot of times people like, and similar to how I referenced the Anthony Lowenstein's book, like to think about places like Gaza and the West Bank as being these like laboratories of what surveillance could be, right? And there's something a bit off about that analogy in terms of thinking about these places as being laboratories to a certain extent reduces the real experiences of people that are there, right? And like reduces this like real harm that's being done right now in order to prioritize a sort of like hypothetical future that we might come across, right? It's like in terms of prioritizing or like putting on the pedestal this like hypothetical future that we might experience in, for example, South Africa or in the United States, while these technologies are actually being are harming communities and are harming people currently as we speak in Gaza in the West Bank. And I think there's something to be said about resisting them in the place that they are, in the time that they are, without necessarily like thinking hypothetically about what this might look like when it comes to like a city near you, for example. But I do
Susan, I'm just going to ask you to pause there for a moment because we need to go for an ad break. But hold that thought. We will be back after the break.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Shimmer, sparkle, captivate. Nothing less than a masterpiece. Droplets of gold inspires precious design. Platinum bursts with intricate freshness. And every pure diamond becomes more than just a girl's best friend. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, where timeless dreams become a reality. Come to us. We tailor-make designer gold, platinum, and diamond jewelry. Trade in or remodel your old gold. Clad yourself with classy name-branded watches. We offer insurance valuation and free zakat calculation. Visit us at 534 Ridge Road, Overport, or call 031 208 9142. Voda Gold Gem Jewelers, manufacturers of fine gold and diamond jewelry.
Dad, these Frymax chips are so tasty.
Wow, that really takes me back. My dad bought me a Frymax chips every day after school. They were my favorite when I was your age as well. Quality is at the very heart of what we do, and that's why we ensure that every Frymax packet is filled with the beautiful goodness and flavor-packed taste that you've come to expect from us since 1982. Frymax, from generation to generation.
You South African, of course. You anxious about the future. We've got you covered. Build on your wealth portfolio with Randry Jewelers Gold Coin Exchange. Visit us at 151 Stephen Dlamini Road, Musgrave, Durban, or call us on 031-202-4700 for more information. Randry Jewelers Gold Coin Exchange, your passport to gold investment.
Africa. Give the gift of clean water with Africa Muslims Agency. With every water well or borehole you donate, your drop becomes a river. reconnecting communities to nourishment, education, dignity and empowerment. Sponsor a water well for 17,000 Rand in Africa or a borehole for 65,000 Rand in Afghanistan or Africa. Quench the thirst. Reconnect the soul with Africa Muslims Agency.
Are you banking with convenience, transparency, and flexibility? With Al Barakah Bank's transactional banking account, you can enjoy convenient everyday banking designed around your needs. Benefit from zero fees on point-of-sale transactions and manage your banking easily through Al Barakah's secure mobile banking app and internet banking platform. From everyday payments to managing your personal or business banking, Al Barakah makes banking simple, transparent, and convenient. Visit albarakah.co.za to learn more. Al Barakah, your partner bank. Al Barakah Bank Limited is an authorized financial services and credit provider.
Listen to something fresh. Listen to Salam Media, your humanitarian broadcaster.
Thank you for staying with us. Welcome to the Mid-Morning Talk with your host, Aaliyah. We have with us in studio Susan Aboeid, who is currently at Georgetown Law and is a researcher and advocate for all sorts of really important things. So I'd like to dive back into what we were speaking about just before the break. We were speaking about the idea of these laboratories of surveillance and technology, for example, in Gaza and in the West Bank. Shall we just like wrap up that point and can you tell us more? Sure.
No, for sure. Like we were just saying just before the break was that, thinking about these places as laboratories, I think definitely has its benefits in terms of, how we organize and how we resist. But I think that there's also something to be said about confronting these technologies head on without necessarily prioritizing this hypothetical future and the harm that can come to us pretty much like outside of those contexts. And I think that there's pros and cons to every approach. But I think it's just like something that we should keep in mind.
100%. Yeah, absolutely. Very important. Something that we need to consider, especially in these local government elections that we have coming up. Make sure that you are aware of your party manifestos. What are their views on privacy? What are their views on surveillance? It's very important for the average citizen around the world. I know that you have worked to, advocate for disarmament as well, which seems like a mammoth task, and that you worked at the Arms Division for Human Rights Watch. Could you speak to us a little bit about your position there and, perhaps if there were any standout cases that you'd like to share with us or if you're allowed to share with us?
Yeah. So I was working for Human Rights Watch within the Arms Division for about 3 years. And the Arms Division is now like no longer a standalone division. It's sort of been absorbed into crisis and conflict in arms. But there we sort of worked on, a lot of indiscriminate weapons. Primarily, we were working on landmines, cluster munitions, incendiary weapons, and killer robots or like autonomous weapons. And one thing that was, I had the honor to work with just incredible advocates who've been doing this work for many years. And one thing that was very inspiring is that this is like the same group of people, along with coalitions, of course, that like pushed through for a landmine ban treaty, essentially, the mine ban treaty, and also pushed for cluster munition banned. So the thing is, a lot of times when I think of the work, even just like in this short stint is like being very inevitable. And I think now the main thing that we're working on and have been working on for, I think like the past, I want to say 14, 15 years is advocating around autonomous weapons or killer robots. And essentially these are just weapons that are autonomous in nature from like start to finish, right? So
that literally gives me goosebumps.
Yeah, literally. I know. It sounds very like hypothetical future, very like sci-fi, but it's real, and we're seeing the precursors to this now in Ukraine. We're seeing it in Gaza. And a lot of times it's like these are weapons that once you start and they essentially search out their target and like emit force on this target all autonomously. So it all depends on like how they're coded and how, what does the algorithm look like? What is the backend? And as you can imagine, these are like raise considerably amount of like ethical, moral, legal concerns. And one thing that we're coming across, or that we came across within this organization, within Human Rights Watch, but also working with campaigns such as the Stop Killer Robots campaigns, is that even though that there's a lot of, I want to say, popular inertia for having some sort of regulation or ban or treaty regulating these weapon systems, a lot of times like there's incredible amount of like standstill, gridlock within these international fora. So for example, like the Convention on Conventional Weapons, or within the UN General Assembly. And the thing is, based off of how I've seen, this group advocate for landmines and cluster munitions at a time where a lot of people thought that these weapons have been so proliferated and are inevitable in warfare, I think there's something to be said about like holding out hope and advocating. And this work is like it's very long term. I think like I left at a point to go to law school, but one thing that I was like thinking about going to law school is that I wanted to go back into that world and like continue advocating for this treaty once I graduated. And I do know that once the sad thing is like after 3 years of law school, I know that we're going to be in a very similar place in terms of advocating and things.
We'll have like bigger problems or technologies to worry about.
Exactly. And the thing is about with autonomous weapons specifically, one thing that we brought up a lot within these meetings is that technology advances at an exponential pace in a way that the legal landscape is already very far behind. But how do we, at the time, we were trying to have a legal mechanism in place to sort of stall that innovation or production in that way. But now I think that it's going to be mostly after the fact about how do we regulate these weapons and maybe potentially ban these weapons after they've already been deployed and used in warfare. But I do think that even though that's kind of scary and a daunting task, landmines were banned after they were already being used in warfare, cluster munitions as well. So I think that there's like something to be said there. In terms of standout cases, I think that the way that the organization or the division worked, that there weren't really standout cases necessarily, but it was a lot of like slow and steady work, which I think was very useful in terms of.
It's super important as well.
No, exactly.
Yeah, so I mean, like we've spoken about these emerging technologies. The one arm seems to be like surveillance technology. The other arm is like the arms.
Yeah, but the thing is, and this is like something that I've explained to people whenever they're like, "Oh yeah, but now you're into surveillance and privacy. Like, how did you get into that from disarmament work?" The thing is, a lot of times, like my work with autonomous weapons and killer robots specifically, surveillance tech is honestly a precursor to those types of weapon systems, right? It's like in order to figure out and to build out what your target profile looks like, or what you want these weapons or who you want these weapons to target, is that you have to have an immense amount of surveillance data to figure out to train the data, to train the algorithms, but then also to figure out who you want to target. I know that sounds really like scary and bad, but like, what are you training these weapons on, right? Is it a certain type of phenotype? Is it a certain type of biometric data? And this is, now we're seeing a lot of surveillance drones, for example, that are built off of the same foundation that you then equipped with more, then you can just like equip those same weapons or those same drones that you have with lethal force.
Thank you for clarifying that. I mean, yeah, they are very, very connected when you put it that way. So very, very important articulation. So the last thing I want to chat about briefly is you are also a co-curator of an exhibition titled A Prison, a Prisoner, and a Prison Guard, which explores the themes of carcerality in the MENA region through contemporary Middle Eastern prison art. And how does your role as a researcher and an advocate harmonize with this? Tell us a little bit more about the exhibition.
Yeah, sure. Wow, we're really running out of time. This is so sad. But so a couple of years ago, my friend and I, we were both at the time working for Human Rights Watch, and we're doing a lot of sort of I wouldn't say victim interviews, but maybe like that's not a good way to put it, but interviews in terms of like, writing reports and gathering just like human rights fact finding in that way. But we did realize that a lot of times throughout this very like empirical work, either being through traditional human rights fields or in the legal landscape, is that a lot of times like human experience gets lost within not necessarily translation, but translation not in terms of like cross language barriers, but translation from like taking someone's experiences and translate it into written form, or translating it into report format, for example. What gets added in, what gets left out, and how do we sort of like choose what to include and what not to include? And then also, how do those experiences get diluted in something that's palatable to, say, like a wider audience or policymakers? And one thing that we realized was that a lot of these experiences get flattened in through our traditional means of reporting. And we're thinking, at the time together, she was translating Syrian prison literature at the time. And I was like, I had experiences with Middle Eastern art from my college years. And I had a great professor and curator at the time who was teaching us, was like, how do we make sense of these experiences? How can we make sense of these experiences beyond written word, right? A lot of times, like within prison literature, you have a lot of writers that say, like, this is only a fraction of my experiences. Like, how can I express this like grave level of injustice that's happened to me when words portray me, but then also like silence betrays me as well. And there's like, Fajr Berikhdad has like a great quote about that in one of his poems, the silence or the injustice of language or silence. I'm going to mess that up. But it's like, we're thinking, and then we decided to look to art. And at the time, there's a lot of, I wouldn't say contemporary Middle Eastern artists. In Middle East, you can say Mina, Swana, however you want to define it. It's more of just like, within this specific region, is how do we think of the prison experience and how are people conveying the prison experience? And there's a great artist at the time and also contemporary and like past artists who have documented this. The title of the exhibit, A Prison, a Prisoner, and a Prison Guard, comes from a poem of Ibrahim Salahi, who is a famous Sudanese poet or artist, yes, and also a poet. And at the time that he was imprisoned in the 1960s, he kept a notebook, which is now his prison notebook that's owned by the MoMA. And in there's like sketches, there's also poetry about his experiences. And one of the poems, Untitled, talks about a prison guard named Hamdan and how Hamdan is illiterate and essentially is like having trouble counting the prisoners. And this is sort of like, Salahi uses this as an allegory to talk about how, the entire country is technically under one prison, and where does the prison start and end, and how do these boundaries become very fluid, whether it's like the prisoner, the prison itself, or the prison guard.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sosan. I am going to have to stop you there, unfortunately, but that's a beautiful note to end on. Another recommendation, Ibrahim Salahi, his art, and as I've recently found out today, his poetry, so I'll definitely take a look.
Incredible.
Yes, that was Sosan Aboeid, a Sudanese American human rights researcher and advocate. We have one more speaker for our program today. Please stay with us for the break. Thank you so much, Sosan. Stay tuned.